My name is Amy Peterson. I'm a project associate with the Child Abuse Prosecution Project here at the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. APA is a private nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., serving prosecutors as well as their law enforcement and community partners. Thank you for joining our Wednesday Child Abuse Prosecution webinar today. Today's webinar, Investigation and Prosecution Techniques of Child Sex Trafficking Cases, will be presented by Senior Deputy District Attorney Yuji Fusa. This presentation is made possible by a grant received from the Office of Justice Programs through the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. APA is very appreciative of their financial assistance and commitment to improving the justice system. Points of view or opinions in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily represent the views of the United States Department of Justice and the Association of Prosecuting Attorneys. By the conclusion of the webinar, you will be emailed a short electronic survey to complete regarding this webinar. If you leave a question in the comment section of the survey, please include your email address so we can respond back to you. This survey helps us to continue to provide quality training to you at no cost to your jurisdiction and assists in future planning for continuing legal education. We are in the process of receiving 1 credit of CLE certification from the state of Virginia for this program, and will email you your certificate when available in the days following this webinar. Please do not leave the webinar early, as we will use the attendee reports to verify attendance for CLE purposes. During today's webinar, you will be able to submit questions for our speaker using the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar located on the right side of your screen. These questions will be forwarded to our speaker, and we will try to cover the issue during our live presentation. There is a lot of material that will be covered by our presenter today, and we may have to follow up with you via email following the webinar. If you need additional assistance, please feel free to contact us directly following the presentation. Today's presenter, J.R. Ujifusa, is the Senior Deputy District Attorney for Multnomah County District Attorney's Human Trafficking Team and is the primary prosecutor for all felony prostitution and human trafficking cases within Multnomah County. J.R. has been working on human trafficking crimes and issues for the last 7 years and is also a Special Assistant United States Attorney for the District of Oregon, focusing on federal human trafficking crimes. I will now turn it over to our presenter, J.R. Ujifusa.
Thanks for everyone logging on today. I know you're all very busy. The first thing I wanted to say was, as you know, many of you know, that an hour is not nearly enough time to go over these topics and cases and subjects. This will be a quick overview, hopefully to get you thinking, to get you being critical about your cases and maybe investigations, and to follow up with what you need. So having said that, we'll get right into it. One of the first things that I like to do, especially in places that are in denial about human trafficking in their area, is I created this little test. So you can use this with law enforcement or prosecutors if they tell you, hey, I don't have a trafficking problem in our area. If you answer yes to all these questions, then you may have a trafficking problem, or guaranteed you do. 1, do you have the internet in your area? 2, do individuals in your area have disposable incomes? 3, do individuals in your area want more money? And 4, do individuals in your area like sex? Of course, I think everyone can answer yes to all 4 of those questions, and that is the reason why I think the interest and the APA has been so kind to invite me to speak on this issue. So, in summary, this webinar will cover 3 main topics: trafficking indicators and trends, investigation techniques, and prosecution techniques. I first want to start off by talking about language and how important language is. It affects attitudes of the courts, law enforcement, victims, and the community. As you can imagine, talking to your victim or labeling her a prostitute may be difficult to get over that barrier when you want to gain trust or in an interview or have her attend a trial or be a witness in a trial. Similarly, you may want to think about how you use the word prostitution versus sex trafficking versus the word pimping. You may want to think about and talk to your investigators and other people you work with about using the term victim or prostituted person or seller versus prostitute or other words. And you may want to think about how you term a buyer. Rather than calling them a John, maybe talk to them as a buyer. as of course we know that there are also females who are buyers, but also John represents, I think, a different sort of stigma to some people. And then talk about how you label your suspects. Are they traffickers? Are they pimps? And why would you use those words? Sometimes that's relevant to the laws in which are in your state. So why sex trafficking? Why is this so important? I'm very leery of some statistics. As you know, sex trafficking and sexual assaults are underreported, and I think numbers are thrown around a lot. But I think it is clear to say that sex trafficking is the second most lucrative criminal enterprise in our nation, and that a 2009 DePaul University study showed that traffickers, maybe inflated a little bit, talked about making between $220,000 to $500,000 a year trafficking adults and minors. The other part that makes sex trafficking so alluring to traffickers is the low cost about getting involved. Most of the time, it can be just taking advantage or manipulating maybe a girlfriend you already have, or a female that you're close to, or a male as well. It's perceived low risk. In many jurisdictions, trafficking is still flying well under the radar, and many defendants and suspects believe that it is a low-risk way of making a lot of money. Also, we see in Portland and everywhere else that there's a high demand, that there's a lot of money to be made, and that that money is what drives the sex trafficking industry. And for many of your jurisdictions, there's a tolerant society. I'm sure all of you have heard that, these are adults doing adult things, and this is the oldest profession known to mankind. Those types of things help fuel the sex trafficking industry. So let's talk a little bit about sex trafficking. In every case that I have been involved with, it follows pretty closely this blueprint. First, the recruiting stage. Many traffickers have been interviewed and speak about how their victims they can identify before even talking to them based on the way they interact with others and their body language. Traffickers are usually recruiting in local hangouts for teenagers or young adults, mass transit areas, schools, malls, things of that nature. And of course, we are seeing a huge problem and a lot of recruiting going on in online social media and apps. Now, of course, like many other crimes, traffickers are lazy and look for low-hanging fruit. So they are going to be looking for victims that are easy to manipulate, that are easy to be talked into or controlled, to sell their body, to sell sex or sexual contact for money. So after that recruiting stage, we see a grooming stage. Now, some of the grooming could be gifts. It could be the fact that that victim comes from a household that has a lot of rules, or that victim does not have the ability to have a cell phone because their parents won't let them. And a lot of times the grooming will be allowing those victims to have the freedom they think they deserve or that they're grown up enough to have. It can include drugs, sort of that partying mentality where we hang out at motels and drink and smoke and there's no curfew or rules. And that grooming can continue for quite a while as a trafficker gradually expands boundaries. What we see is traffickers starting out with expanding boundaries maybe through adult dancing and strip clubs, then talking their victims into maybe trying out stripping, then maybe having that victim sleep with their friends, then talking to that victim about having sexual contact for money. Now, of course, this blueprint, although in my experience it follows pretty closely, this blueprint can take hours, days, weeks, months, and sometimes even years to do. Now, the breaking stage is something that I think is a very important question, and the reason we talk about trafficking is so that when you're investigating and prosecuting, that you can remember to ask these questions, to investigate these different parts of this crime. Breaking is usually when the defendant or suspect changed, and usually a victim, when talking to a victim and them being open about it, may explain to you and usually have a memory about when the trafficker, the defendant, changed his attitude, maybe was physical with them, maybe revealed to them that he's not their boyfriend, he's their trafficker, and they're supposed to make money. But very often, that is a point in time in which your victim can describe. Because the recruiting and grooming phase look a lot like a boyfriend-girlfriend type relationship, or some sort of boyfriend-boyfriend, girlfriend-girlfriend type relationship. Some sort of relationship like that, until the breaking stage, where the victim has realized that they are there to make money for their trafficker. And then, of course, the goal for all traffickers is to have a victim on automatic, meaning that a trafficker does not have to do much, and then that victim automatically goes out, makes money through prostitution, and brings them back their quota or their amount of money. We have seen this for traffickers who are in custody, sometimes in custody or prison in another state, and yet their victims are continually on automatic, making sure they bring money or put money on their commissary. Okay, if you were to ever take a little peruse online about how to be a pimp, you will find thousands of websites, YouTube videos that talk about what a pimp is. I'm not going to go through all these, but this is pretty much the gist of what you'll see online. There are ways in which to talk about getting women. You may see references to books like The Art of Seduction, talking about how to control and manipulate women to get them to do what you want. There's also a different language in human trafficking, and understanding this language may help you identify indicators or identify cases that you may not have thought were trafficking cases. So the first is the game. What I heard described to me a long time ago was the game is a perfect description of human trafficking. Because if you're recruiting kids, what better way to describe the rules than to pretend it's a game? So very often you'll hear the game is trafficking, right? Someone's in the game. They broke the rules of the game. Now words such as trick, lick, or date, of course, refers to acts of prostitution or a buyer. Sometimes they'll use different words for money, for quotas and other descriptions. So a rack is one way to describe $1,000. And of course, all of you out there who are listening to this and watching this, you are squares, someone who is not involved in prostitution. And squares sometimes are used to talk to a victim about how squares don't understand the life, they don't understand the game, they don't understand you. But squares are also used to insulate a trafficker. So many times we see a square, female or male, being used to rent the cars or put the apartment in their name or the hotel in their name, because that's a square not involved in the lifestyle. Now, some of the rules of the game, some of these may be sort of old school, but they still apply. One is reckless eyeballing. That's where victims are not allowed to look at other traffickers or other men in the eye, because that indicates that they want to choose that man instead of their trafficker. Choosing up is sort of the way in which they describe a victim picking another trafficker or being picked by another trafficker. Same with the word knocking. If a trafficker knocks another trafficker's victim, it means they stole them or took them or recruited them. Now you will see in the game the word bottom, bottom bitch, wifey, boss bitch. That usually is termed a female or male who is the most trusted victim in the group. It doesn't necessarily mean the person who's been with the trafficker the longest, but a lot of times that is. And usually the day-to-day management of the victims is controlled by this individual so as to insulate the trafficker from that. A stable or pool may be described sort of the amount of girls that that trafficker or pimp has. Out of pocket is when you're not following the rules of the game. So someone who is out of pocket may be disciplined in one way or another. Where sex trafficking happens. Maybe 5 to 7 years ago, sex trafficking was primarily on busy intersections and high-vice areas and on street corners. That is not the case anymore. In fact, in most of your jurisdictions, you're not going to have a track or a high-vice area where prostitution happens. Most prostitution is now happening online. I just wrote a quick handful of websites that I know about, sort of on the West Coast, but I know that this changes from city to city to state. Chat lines are a big one, as well as social media, dating sites, Facebook, Snapchat, Instagram, all of those websites and apps are used in order to recruit, groom, advertise, and connect with buyers. And of course, residence motels and hotels are used, one, to do the same thing, recruit, advertise, and groom, but also the place where individuals meet once they've met on the internet or these apps or chat lines. And of course, adult establishments are also used. For any of you who have Backpage as a problem in your jurisdiction, I recommend you at least be familiar with the website. This is the Portland Escort section, and this is what it would look like, similar to a Craigslist ad or things you may be familiar with when you sell a couch or look for used tools. It is listed out being the most recent at top and a running list of all the advertisements in any given location. So as you can see on the top, for the state of Oregon, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 different areas of Oregon in which you can look. Now this is just on the Escort site of the Portland Adult Entertainment side of Backpage, in which there are other tabs as well. It's also good to be familiar with the under that search bar that says Gallery. When you click on that, you actually see photographs of the individuals on the advertisements. This can help with investigators and in prosecution if you're looking for someone in particular, an ad in particular, something of that nature. Other websites are a little bit more upfront. This is from TNA Board, and on TNA Board, in some instances, they put out a full menu of sexual acts that they do for the cost. Men review these individuals and write reviews about their sexual experience. So the websites can run the gamut from something talking about escorts and that their payment is for companionship to websites such as this where sexual contact for a fee is discussed out in the open. We're going to talk now a little bit about indicators. One of my favorite tools is still Google. As many of you know, a phone number put into Google will show you a myriad of things. But one of those things which it will show is if there are escort ads on the internet, which is a huge indicator that your victim is involved in trafficking. And that may be a good place to start. Let's talk a little bit about indicators for traffickers and pimps. They can be all ethnicities, all socioeconomic classes, all genders. Usually there is some relationship to a prostitution environment, whether their mother was engaged in prostitution, their father was a trafficker, their cousin is involved in it, something of that nature that they are familiar with sort of that environment. They are normally charming and manipulative. I put psychopathic because individuals who we have had tested for this score very high in the Hare psychopathy checklist, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Trafficking is focused on money and visual success. That is extremely important because that is your motive. And you will see throughout investigations and prosecutions that it always comes back to money. For example, there are some traffickers who don't allow their victims to use drugs. That's because they would be spending their money. Another example, when traffickers are picked up or arrested, usually the calls coming out of jail or the letters are all about the victims making sure they don't spend their money or asking for money to put on their books. You have to understand that traffickers are willing to spend 100% of their time recruiting and grooming an individual to make money for them. That's what they do. And so although we may be working 60, 70 hours a week, they're working full time for the next victim, grooming the next person to make money. Their views of victims are property, and you will see that these victims are branded, they're bought and sold and treated like property. And that is one of the mentalities of these traffickers that we can do some good investigation and prosecution on. I talked about the psychopathy checklist and the test and the family associates involved in prostitution. These are just some indicators. One by themselves, of course, as we know, may not be enough, but these are things to look for as you go out and want to look for trafficking cases in your area. Okay, human trafficking crimes are a combination of domestic violence, the relationship between individuals who are in an intimate relationship, sort of the gang mentality. A lot of times there's that idea of teams or pools or groups against one another. Drugs can be used not only in the victim area, but also when buyers meet with victims, sometimes they'll be trading drugs rather than money. And of course, the sexual assault cases. So they manifest characteristics of these individual crimes. And so we need to be careful and look towards these characteristics. The easiest one for us to understand is domestic violence. One of the biggest points that we see in a trafficker grooming, recruiting, and getting a victim to work is isolation. That can be physical isolation, where a trafficker may take a victim from one place to another, or that may be isolation by taking their phone and their contacts, not allowing them to leave a hotel, or not allowing them to have any conversations or communications with anyone other than their associates. This helps with them relying on their trafficker for everything, whether it's food, water, sleep, clothing, but also making sure a trafficker avoids detection by law enforcement. You will see that part of this isolation, mothers and fathers of the trafficker are involved, siblings, grandparents, roommates, are all involved in this sort of isolation and help the trafficker make sure that their victim feels that the only person they can turn to are the associates of the trafficker. Many of these individuals, including relatives, associates, roommates, also enjoy the benefits of some monetary gain. They get a kickback of some of the victim's profits. And once again, understanding this will help investigation and prosecution. Your traffickers surround your victim with these individuals. So when you're not sure why a victim won't come forward and talk about what's going on with her trafficker, remember her kids may be babysat by your trafficker's sister. The only way she may have a ride out of the home is from your trafficker's mother. The only way she eats is when she's bought food by your trafficker or maybe his sibling or her sibling. So remember this dynamic when you go to look for a trafficking case and are speaking with a victim, understanding that that victim has been isolated and is surrounded with people who have the trafficker's best interest in mind. Let's talk about the victims for a little bit. Once again, all ethnic backgrounds, all socioeconomic classes, usually they are running away from something. So family troubles. It may be they need a place to stay, food and clothing is how they meet their trafficker. They may have been in a fight with their parents over curfew or cell phone use or a party or alcohol use or drug use. They're usually individuals who have low self-esteem. This is where we see that domestic violence similarity. And they create, or a trauma bond is created using the abuse cycle we know so well in domestic violence. For individuals with low self-esteem and family troubles, the grooming and recruiting, the buying of gifts, the show of affection, those types of things create that bond that you'll see a trafficker use to his advantage. Sometimes using violence, and then of course grooming and doing that again, apologizing for that to keep them and that abuse cycle going. These victims are usually looking for love or to be needed, some self-worth. And they will define self-worth if they've had violence or control or manipulation in their family through that violence, control, and manipulation. They also may define their self-worth through money, because that's what their trafficker values most. So many times you may see a victim who sort of expects to be paid certain amounts and has made their worth based on how much they can make in a single night. These victims are easily manipulated. As I said earlier, traffickers look for low-hanging fruit. In many instances, these victims have had a history of abuse of some kind growing up. An example is a letter I came across a while ago, just to illustrate this point, of a victim who describes why she would be best to work for him, why she fits the description of being your bottom bitch. And she says, "It's no game when I tell a pimp I want to be his hoe. I will show dedication in the hoe nation to you and the game. I give back to the game just as much as it deserves." This is about a 12-page. Talks about how she was abused as a child, how her mom was engaged in prostitution and her mom's boyfriend was a trafficker, and how she was originally put out on the street at age 12 after her birthday for this trafficker to describe to her that she could make more money out on the track than she did for her birthday. She then writes this individual in custody, not knowing him at all, trying to sell him that she should work for him. All right, other indicators that you may see. Media. Some of the words we talked about, the phrases we talked about, maybe the pictures and descriptions of what these individuals are doing. Relationships. If you have an individual you've identified as a victim and they are roommates with 3 other people, that may be a good indicator of those other people may be involved as well. Other cases. In custody intelligence, the lifestyle and the language they use, where they're employed or not employed, and where they're located or hang out at. One of the biggest things I would like to discuss, or at least highlight, is cases coming into your office, to your unit, that aren't identified as human trafficking, but definitely are. So when we talk about these indicators, I want you to think about cases such as sexual abuse cases, sexual assault cases, child pornography cases, domestic violence cases, gang cases, gun cases, drug cases, where you have seen some of these indicators. This is one. This is a domestic violence case that came in just as an assault case. But if you look through the phone, you can see that this is more than just an assault case. Although ads is spelled wrong, this victim has been posting on the internet, making ads. She's also asking her daddy, a common phrase used for her trafficker, if Skins, an adult club, is a good club for her to work. In a different case, this case came in as a kidnap case. In the domestic violence unit in our office. One of the things we identified early is, as I worked in the domestic violence unit, I didn't notice people who are intimately involved demanding money or stealing money. And as I read this police report, sort of the violence involved with it, but also the idea of money being stolen over and over again, I came to realize, and the victim admitted at grand jury, that she had been working for this trafficker and had never mentioned that to the police. Let's talk about investigations. Human trafficking investigations are some of the most challenging but rewarding investigations you can be involved with. It takes a special type of investigator to work these cases because they are so challenging, because they are labor intense, they are intense as far as working with victims and witnesses. Your goal in an investigation is to corroborate the victim's statements, corroborate that relationship between your victim and the defendant, and to corroborate, of course, commercial sex acts. Now, the victim statements we'll talk about a little bit later on, but of course your investigation should be victim-centered. That means you should be thoughtful about your victim's safety, the relationship with your victim, to make sure that we're not using the victim to get to the suspect. One of the ways in which we can do that is to keep our word. I have seen time and time again that victims will go back to the investigators who kept their word, who treated them kindly, and who were honest with them about their dealings with them. I want to talk about being defendant-focused. In our office, we try really hard to be defendant-focused. What that means to us is we may not be able to make a trafficking case on a defendant that we know is trafficking, but we will be creative to make some sort of case, to do something to focus on that defendant. One of the things I can't stress enough is patience. You may not be able to make that case right away, but being able to be victim-centered and thoughtful and keep your word as an investigator, I have seen time and time again that victims will come back, and there will be a breaking point where their trafficker has assaulted them one too many times, or their trafficker was caught with another female or male, or their trafficker has left the state or is arrested for something else, where they will come back to you and want to finally talk about the trafficking case. Having said that, these cases can also be time sensitive, meaning that once a victim is willing to talk, the window of opportunity to get in front of that victim in front of a grand jury or to a detective or their statements out, one needs to act on that as soon as possible. And of course, being thorough. Your victims may have arrests and priors. They may be living a life in which it is very hard to determine what phone number they used, where they were living, who they talked to. And so a thorough investigation is critical, because 6 months, a year down the line when you go to trial, the amount of thoroughness in your investigation may be the difference between a plea and a trial. Okay, we talked a little bit about victim care and support. That should be a consideration you have at the very beginning. How you're going to treat this victim, where you're going to meet this victim, if we have clothes and a cell phone, if we're going to take those things, how this victim is going to eat, because many times they haven't eaten in a long time, and where they're going to go and what support they're going to have. Interviewing witnesses, cooperators, defense witnesses is important. As you know, when we talked about the most trusted victim or the bottom or the boss, you want to go into your investigation having an idea of how you're going to deal with these individuals, if they cooperate or not. The most important part of this investigation, besides the victim statements, I think, is electronic evidence. Internet and social media can be key to forming that evidence to show the relationship, to show your defendant's state of mind, his motive, his language, where he's been, those types of things. In order for a trafficker to be successful, they have to show to victims that they're successful. So unlike many crimes where individuals try to hide it, part of being a trafficker is to flaunt the amount of money and things you're getting in order to recruit other victims. Cell phones. Be very careful. There are a lot of emerging case law on warrants and how you can go about getting a cell phone, but a cell phone is a wealth of information, both of location, conversations, pictures, videos, things of that nature. Same with computers and tablets. And make sure you remember to think about GPS and IP addresses when you're looking into website, apps, things of that nature. Phone detail records, surveillance, and pretext calls can be helpful. Financial evidence. Remember, these cases are all about money, and you may be able to trace Western Union, MoneyGram, maybe how individuals paid for ads online, things of that nature. And medical evidence. Of course, going back in time to show that there was a relationship can be key. So searching out medical evidence in your investigation. And then, of course, information on the defendant and his interview. Now, interviewing victims and witnesses. Of course, everyone does this differently. I don't claim to be an expert in interviewing victims or witnesses, but what I have seen as a prosecutor, I think can be helpful. One, if an interview starts with, "Who's your pimp?" that interview is not going anywhere. You want to talk about the relationship between the victim and the trafficker. Ask them, so what did he do for you? Were you in an intimate relationship? Did you live together? Who took care of the money? Who got to control what was going on? Was he ever mad at you? Were there ever things that you could say as far as, no, I can't do that, or I don't want to do that? And how did he treat you when you did that? A timeline. A timeline is super important. We'll talk a little bit about that at trial, but a timeline for interviewing a victim and a witness can be key. Sometimes detectives will use a calendar and bring that out for them to visually look at when these acts occurred. Other times it may be identifying familiar dates, birthdays, holidays, for them to remember, oh no, this part happened before Christmas, and then we spent Christmas here. After Christmas we went to this city, and this is what happened. So use a timeline to your advantage and pick familiar dates so that when the prosecutors are looking at this case, they may be able to be better able to choose charges that focus on those specific dates that will help you out. Be prepared on that interview. I have seen great interviews where a detective has been familiar with whose contacts are in the victim's phone if they've been able to look at that before, the ads and where they were, maybe some prior police reports about some interaction between the defendant and the victim and police. Be prepared for those things so that we can corroborate, oh, this phone contact is so-and-so. He's a buyer that I meet on a regular basis. Oh, this prostitution ad in Las Vegas, I remember that. That was when he took me to Vegas for a week. Or he took me to Vegas for a week, and then identifying the ad that came with it. Reports, right? We were stopped for a traffic violation as we were heading from this city to this city. Demeanor. Remember that these victims have a preconceived notion of police. They have been told that police are bad, that police are going to throw them in jail, that police are going to lie and manipulate them. That is what they have going into it. And if traffickers have been doing this for a while, that is one of the first things that they do, is make sure that their victims don't speak to police, because that insulates them from charges. Pace yourself. Remember, these cases aren't like a single incident. There may be years of relationship between your victim and your trafficker. Make sure you take your time and cover what you need to. Allow those victims some control and witnesses some control, whether it's taking breaks, getting a drink, pausing and coming back to it, but allow them to have some control and be victim-centered. Treat them as a victim. Those will go a long way towards not only your investigation then, but maybe getting information from previous cases or future investigations. For example, this is a slide from a federal trial that I was involved with, just to illustrate to a jury what this relationship looks like. So as you can see on the top, in 7 days from April 1st to April 8th, there were 210 phone calls or text messages between the two. There was roughly $8,000 deposited in either the defendant's account or the joint account controlled by the defendant. During that same time, you can see Backpage and escort ads posted with this victim, as well as lining up the travel to and from Portland, Nevada, Sacramento, that corroborate the ads that you see above. Now, I've talked to Amy about passing out this or having it available, this Human Trafficking Investigators Checklist. This is something that myself and investigators created to help remind you of maybe some things you need to ask as this goes, as these investigations sometimes go very quickly, and I'll make that available to you. Here's what part of it looks like. It's a double-sided single sheet that you can use to help remind you or fill in some of the things that you may need to ask or find out. Okay, victim cooperation. Be thoughtful about who interviews, who is present, where the interview happened, and other things like that. Remember, we talked about them being brainwashed by their trafficker not to talk. And understand that the level of cooperation and truthfulness may not be what you want at the very beginning. It may take multiple interviews. It may take some time in order for them to gain the trust, or you to gain the trust from them that will help them cooperate and be truthful. And then remember your grand jury or pretrial timing to make sure that that coincides as well. One of the things I try to emphasize about investigations is investigate cases with the intent to prosecute without the victim's cooperation. So go into that investigation believing that at some point your victim may not want to cooperate. And do you have enough to go forward without your victim? I think that cooperation is key to that. And if you're able to cooperate, one, you're able to say to your victim, this isn't all on your shoulders. You are one piece of a large puzzle. You can take some of the weight off your victim's shoulders, which I think in turn will allow them to not feel so nervous and have anxiety about being able to testify if they believe that they are just one piece to the puzzle. In fact, in a recent case, I told a victim that whether or not she testified, we were still going forward with the prosecution. And after that, she said, well, if you're going to do it anyway, I might as well testify. Proof through non-subjective means. When you corroborate things that there's no way it's left up to interpretation, your jury will, or victim, your jury will trust your investigator, and most of the time that means they'll distrust your trafficker statements, because many of them give statements in interviews because they believe they can manipulate the detective. And don't ignore the small stuff, and I'll give you an example of that. You don't need to just corroborate the elements of your case. Corroborate small things. It just leads to credibility of your victim and of your investigation. Example of this, and we were having audio technical difficulties early, so hopefully you can hear this. In an investigation that was done a while ago, a minor victim talked about having her lips tattooed on the defendant's neck. Now that's an easy, simple, either it happened or it didn't. What we ended up doing was during his interview, we made sure that we brought up that question to ask him whose lips those are. So I'm going to have you listen to this. I'm going to talk about how this affected the trial.
Perfect. I noticed that tattoo on your neck. It's a kiss. Whose lips are those?
No, this is my mom's.
Your mom's?
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
So detectives asked, whose lips are those on your neck? The defendant stutters for a second and says, those are my mom's. This happens 2 more times during his 3-hour interview. What that does to the jury, I spoke to the jury after this trial, it made them not believe a word he said during those 3 hours. In addition to that testimony of the victim, we also found the tattoo artist. And he was interviewed and corroborated that yes, he did that tattoo. Yes, he identified the victim. She kissed a piece of parchment paper which he traced on the defendant's neck and tattooed that on his neck. That's an example of something small that made a huge difference in the eyes of your jurors. Another example, pay attention to little details in ads and statements, how people write, what words they use, how they spell certain words. In this ad, we noticed that on the back page ad that they accept debit and credit. Well, that was something new to us. And as we started to investigate that, we realized that the victims were using a Square One account. Square One account is something you see in small vendors sometimes where you can apply it to your cell phone and use a debit or credit card to charge someone. So having realized that this ad was the only one in Portland at the time that accept debit or credit, we subpoenaed records from Square Inc., the people who do Square One, and were able to find records of our trafficker and the money he made based on this account where individuals were swiping cards at the scene of the Prostitution Act. Like I said, trafficking cases are all about money, and traffickers rarely allow other people than themselves to control or receive money. And so, of course, the account was in his name. Interviewing. Sometimes a defendant will start unraveling his own sweater by talking about things in which he is not a part of. I'm going to let this speak for itself. But this is a defendant who was interviewed about the game, just so detectives could get an idea about the words he used and his knowledge of trafficking.
You know what I'm saying? You can see, and he's talking about in the game of, this is what, listen, if you guys want to continue this conversation, what I'm not going to tolerate is the, patronize. You guys are going to sit here and try to, the game and try to make it.
How we talk every day, because that's how we talk.
Hey, I don't talk like that, okay? It's offensive. I don't talk like that, okay? I'm in college. So all this crap about your pimp and all this little crap like this is what I want you guys to do. I want you guys to lock up people who are committing crimes. I want you to lock up real pimps, people who are really doing this in real life, not somebody who got into contact with some freak girl, you know what I'm saying, who's mad because she's fat and I don't like her.
Okay, so a couple good things in there. He wants us to lock up real pimps. He's not a real pimp. He's a college student. Later on, we find a video on his cell phone, and the jury gets to hear this.
We're live here in the doubles as an air freshener. Here, we have today on VN Session in Paula, we have Elizabeth Castanova, from Portland, Oregon. We want to know what got you into the game, and what do you like most about the life? Your questions.
What got you into the game, and what do you like most about the life? So, needless to say, this individual, when he took the stand, it was hard for him to explain both of these situations. And we were able to corroborate that not only did he use those words, but that he had a good understanding about the game and everything associated with that. We talk a little bit about isolation. I'm not going to show this whole video for the sake of time, but this is a video we also found on this individual's phone that shows the sort of treatment that traffickers will use of victims. And it's very similar to a child abuse sort of treatment, where they treat them almost as children.
Told y'all, man, to quit fucking with a P, man. I told y'all, we're in a motherfucking business, man. We don't got time for motherfucking playing. You see why last night I told you, bitch, we about business, not pleasure, bitch. And you made last night, bitch, all about motherfucking pleasure. Bitch, but you about to find out today, bitch, it's all about business, because you about to be working all day, bitch. And you know what I'm saying? You motherfucking sleeping up in here, bitch. Knock the fuck out and shit at 1 motherfucking o'clock, bitch. A nigga can't even go to the house to come back, bitch, without you motherfucking dead asleep or some motherfucking shit. You know what I'm saying? A nigga gotta get it in another room. Bitch, is you motherfucking stupid or something? Bitch, turn around. Turn the fuck around. Ain't nobody talking to you, bitch. You know who I'm talking to, nigga. Was you here? Then I wasn't talking to you then. You know what I'm saying? And then the nigga got a motherfucking, had a...
Okay, so a couple things about this case. Our victim described that that individual, when he would beat her with a belt, would make a specific statement, there in quotes. A faggot gets what a faggot gets. Now this is our victim talking to police well before we find this, if you see on the bottom of the screen. This is the trafficker's bottom saying the exact same phrase to our victim on social media. In addition to this, we corroborated the bedspread found in that video. Now that trafficker would make victims stand in corners as part of a punishment for when they weren't following his rules or when they were out of pocket. That corroboration was extremely helpful to the jury when we were talking about trusting a victim who was addicted to methamphetamine, who of course had a history of her own, and was talking about specific instances that I think for the layperson seems a little unreal as far as standing in corners and whipping with belts, saying certain phrases. So as part of this corroboration, I think one of the best places to look are prior traffic stops or police encounters. Read those reports. Talk to those officers. There are many examples that document just the victim in the car that may go directly against what your trafficker says as far as, I've only known her 3 days, or I don't know who you're talking about, I've never associated with them. Look at the locations of the stop. Maybe who else was in the car as a witness or someone else that may be a victim. And what the defendants and others said. Maybe the employment, where they work, who they live with, and how they're related to the people either in the car or at the police scene. Those can help with corroboration for many things involving your trafficking case. Because remember, these cases aren't just a single incident. They reach back in time, sometimes months or even years. Okay, charging decisions, one of my favorite topics. The first thing I think we need to consider are proof of separate incidents. In the state of Oregon, separate incidents allow a judge to go consecutive with time. Separate victims, right? How are we going to charge this? Are we going to charge for each victim or maybe a group of victims as an enterprise? Every separate victim also allows a judge to go consecutive if they would like. Same with separate harms. And when you think about the proof, think about separate dates or a date range. I talked earlier about holidays or dates that the victim may have in their mind that stick out to them. Well, that will really help with your charging document. If they say, I remember that I worked between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then we went out of town and we came back and then I worked after New Year's, then that will help you with what you charge and the date ranges you charge. Maybe instead of one single trafficking charge, you do two based on that testimony and those dates. Think very carefully about how you're setting your defendant up for future sentences, both in state court and in federal court. Maybe making them a career criminal. Maybe making them set up for what we have in Oregon, which is a multiple conviction sex offender, and those sentences and how they may affect your defendant. Think about the evidence you want the jury to hear. I think it's important for the jury to hear about how they tampered with the victim. Maybe the violence associated with their relationship even before the trafficking began. So really think about trying to paint the biggest picture you can about this relationship and what charges you will need that will allow you to do that in front of your jury. Think about sentencing arguments, both concurrent and consecutive time, exposures, grid blocks, things of that nature, and then think about mandatory sentences, enhancements, things that will make your charges stick out and your sentence larger. I can't express enough, know the laws in your area. Not just the trafficking laws, not just the assault laws, but know what sentencing laws affect child pornography, or maybe allowing a minor to engage in lewd conduct, or allowing others to view a child in lewd conduct. Be creative with your charging decisions. I talked earlier about being defendant-focused. You may have evidentiary problems on a trafficking charge, but it may be easy to prove a child pornography charge. It may be easier to prove that this individual took a minor to a strip club and had her dance under a false name. Make sure that you think about those additional charges so that your jury can find those and allow the judge to have more time to use the sentence. We talked about painting a bigger picture. Think about victim testimony problems and what charges you can use that aren't based on just your victim's testimony. Use the defendant's criminal history effectively. I talked a little bit about that with setting them up, but also understanding their criminal history to what they may be eligible for in your case. And then offender-specific investigations will allow you to charge traffickers with other things that may not be trafficking in order to help them, help your victim, help the defendant or suspect be taken off the street that may result in a later investigation and cooperation by your victim for a trafficking charge. Okay, so think about charges in the domestic violence case load. Assault, menacing, coercions. Think about sexual assaults, rapes, sexual assault cases. Think about drug cases and possession. Maybe some charges that are usually affiliated with gang cases, such as maybe some robberies or some other things like that. Think about even ID theft and computer crimes. Many traffickers use their victims to also boost things and steal things as a way to make extra money when they're unable or can't make that much money through prostitution. And then your sentencing laws. I'm going to give some examples in Oregon just to give you an idea of how those sentencing laws may affect the way you charge a case. We have a sentencing law that allows life without the possibility of parole if a defendant has had 2 separate felony sex offense convictions. So you may not want to join cases between 2 victims because you may want to set them up for life without the possibility of parole. In addition to that, you may have mandatory minimums. In Oregon, we have from 70 months to 25 years based on the charges that you pick. So I may be charging a trafficking case, but in Oregon, if a trafficker allows an adult to view a minor engaged in sexually explicit conduct, they also fall under this charge. The advantage of this charge is that if you commit 2 within the same charging instrument that are separate criminal episodes, your mandatory minimum is 25 years as opposed to 70 months without charging this crime. Another example, identity theft. In Oregon, we have repeat property offense statutes, which require prison for certain identity thefts depending on your priors. In many instances, our traffickers use different PINs or names to reach out to victims and associates and co-defendants while they're in custody. This is an example of where our victim, whose phone number is in the middle, was called by 3 different inmates on the same day, all happening to be the defendant using those inmates' PINs. And that may be something where you can be creative, charging an ID theft, as well as maybe a tampering or a hindering prosecution. All right, additional tools. We talked a little bit about this, but fraud crimes, computer crimes, kidnapping, witness tampering are all tools that you can use to help out prosecute these individuals. Now remember, in federal cases, they do not have to cross state lines. They have to affect interstate commerce, which means that you can charge purely local incidents with federal crimes if they use a hotel or a condom or use Backpage or some other server or get clothing or hair extensions if they affect interstate commerce. And there's some of the sites for cases in which they have found that this affects interstate commerce. For the sake of time, I'm going to go quickly through the end so we have some time for questions. Let's talk about after you indict a defendant. There's a lot of work to be done, and I make sure that the detectives, investigators know that there's a lot of work to be done after we indict. We still may be looking at associates who have helped out this trafficking. We are going to be looking at jail intelligence. Tattoos are photographed in our jail. There may be visits or deposit slips that identify other victims or may show that our victim is still helping them out. We may read their mail or monitor their phone calls or jail visits. This will help us identify other victims, maybe identify other electronic evidence or financial evidence, lead us to a website or social media that is important, lead us to other email accounts or internet ads. And one of the most important things about monitoring this is this may help us know when to make a move. When a victim who hasn't been cooperative may be cooperative because of the last phone call they had with the defendant where they're in a fight. Or maybe when a victim talks about something that's going on in their life that we're able to then talk to them. Or maybe when a co-defendant talks about wanting to talk to the DA about something. This may help us help us knowing when to make a move, when to do something we normally weren't able to do during our investigation. There are some of the tattoos that are associated with trafficking in this area. MOB, meaning money over bitches. 82nd was our high vice area, and some other things that we can associate with trafficking or we got from inmate tattoos. Same with victim tattoos. As I talked about victims being branded, many times victims are branded with the trafficker's name, such as Pimpolino, one of my favorites, but other things that you may use to help your case or corroborate certain things. Visiting lists are extremely important. The defendant in our area fills out these visiting lists and may identify victims for you and their phone numbers and their age and their relationship to them. That relationship may change, which is one of the reasons I talked about being able to know when to make your move. This is from the same defendant, and sometimes they will be listed as ex-girlfriend or girlfriend. Sometimes it was girlfriend, now it's fiance. And of course, money drops. Who's dropping the money when, and what the defendant knows about that money. In Oregon, receiving money knowing it comes from prostitution is also a crime, and you may have additional crimes based on them in custody waiting for your case. Negotiations. I will go through this very quick. As you know, or if you don't know, it is common, at least in my caseload, that traffickers are a higher percentage of individuals who want trial. I meet with the defendant and defense early. I try to always let them know about the victim cooperation because showing a strong hand will help with negotiations. I make sure I talk about all their exposure based on all their charges, and I allow them to talk. I give examples to them about comparables and let them think they have a little bit of control. But don't be afraid to show your case in the corroboration so that they know that if the victim doesn't show, which they're hoping on, or if the victim says something that isn't exactly what she told police, that your case is still strong and going to go forward. Remember these federal enhancements. I think each state is very similar. That's why I put the federal ones up, to talk to your defendant about their exposure even above what their grid block or guidelines may be. And witness preparation. Keep your victim and their advocates, if they have them, informed. When they don't know what's going on or are fearful that something's going on that they don't have control of, that is when you lose cooperation or maybe even contact with your victims. Meet with them early and with advocates as soon as possible if you're a prosecutor. I know that's different than the traditional prosecution model. It's very important. Allow your victim to see and experience the courtroom before trial. Take them through the courtroom. Show them where they'll be sitting. Show them where you'll be sitting. Go through the process so that the unknown doesn't keep them from cooperating. Explain the full process of testifying, how you will have the last chance to ask them questions. Have support lined up for them for trial, clothing, rides, security, and situations set in place for tampering or other associates trying to intimidate your victim. I'll go through this really quickly. I just want to tell you that in my cases with trafficking, the jurors that I have talked to, one of the things they said most is being able to organize your evidence in a clear, consistent way and having a timeline of events was what they wanted the most out of that trial because there is so much information. We talked about using a PowerPoint, and I talk about using a PowerPoint and timeline to help with that organization so that your jurors can follow the long history and relationship with this defendant. And then, of course, sentencing. Educate your court regarding the scope of this crime. They realize that the amount of work and effort it takes for a trafficker to recruit, groom, and get someone to work, it becomes a little bit more important to that court. Emphasize the fact that the violence and the control and the lack of choices of your victim. Make sure you use departures. It allows the court to hear more and allows the court to have more time to use. Talk to your pre-sentence investigation unit. Don't just allow them to write a report. Ask questions. Be a resource for them if they have any questions about the trial or about this individual. Talk to your victim about making a victim impact statement. The court knows what you're going to ask for as a prosecutor, but having a victim describe the effect it had on them is extremely important. And make sure you look for restitution, compensatory fine, and no contact with the victim, as many of these traffickers reach out to their victim even when in prison. One of the ways in which we get sentencings that are higher is through a dangerous offender. I told you I'd talk about psychopathy. I'm not going to go through this ORS because it's for Oregon, but I want to tell you that in one trafficker's analysis, they scored a 100th percentile among prison inmates in maximum security housing for aggressive narcissism. That their psychopathy and violence risk appraisal guide for trafficking for this trafficker was 100% within 7 years and 100% within 10 years. I have had multiple sort of psychopathy tests done with traffickers based on things that we've done through trial, and many of them, especially your prolific traffickers, will score extremely high in aggressive narcissism and personality disorder. This will help educate your court as to the dangerousness of these individuals. Okay, we got through in just a little bit extra time. There's my contact information, and I think we're going to open it up to questions because I think most people are still have a little bit of time to watch. You're always welcome to call me or text me on that cell or email me. I am an administrator on a sex trafficking listserv for prosecutors and investigators only, law enforcement only, nationwide, and I'll be sending out a link to that through Amy so that if you want to be involved on that listserv, we can get involved as well. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, JR. We actually have one question, so I'll ask that so we can get that out of the way. What are the advantages or disadvantages of charging federal crime of trafficking versus using state statutes?
That's a great question. So state charges, there are some advantages to state charges. Those would be maybe speed of which your trial commences, right? You may be able to get to grand jury quicker, trial quicker. You may be able to do things that you can't do, such as some of your sentencing components. Sometimes my exposure in state court is higher than exposure in federal court. On the reverse, there are sometimes federal cases you need those resources. You may have a case that spans multiple states. Maybe there are some acts that aren't in your county but are in your state that you can charge. Maybe you need the assistance of the FBI or an analysis, or maybe you need more time, which federal court allows for you, to get your victim in a place where they're able to cooperate and are safe and are able to talk about what has happened to them. So some of it is time, some of it is resources, some of it is exposure of your defendant. Some may be whether the jurisdiction is willing to, or your investigator is willing to do those things. So those are some of the things that we look towards, and having a good relationship with your federal prosecutors and your state prosecutors and meeting often will help you understand where that line may be.
Okay, great. If anyone has any other questions, they can email us at webinars@apainc.org or JR directly from his contact information that is on the PowerPoint. Thank you, JR, for an excellent and very informative presentation.
Thank you.
All APA webinar materials and recordings are available on our website. Follow us on Twitter at APA_CAPP for upcoming events and webinars. Please join us next week for our Wednesday webinar, Exchanging Best Practices for Prosecuting Child Sexual Abuse Cases, presented by Jim Carpenter of the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office. Thank you for attending and have a great day.